Welcome to Cooper and Cary Have Words. It's great to be back with you. And my name is James Cary. I'm the Cary half. And again, frustratingly close but not present is Barry Cooper over there in Epsom. Hello to you, Barry.
Hello, James. Lovely to see you. And good to be in England.
It is. It is good to be in England. And absurdly close to you, over in Leatherhead, is the pastor of Grace Church, called John Herring. Hello, John.
Hello.
We're thrilled that you're able to join us because we're going to talk about jazz. And just to fill people in very quickly, John used to be an secondary school teacher. Was it a music teacher?
It was music, yeah.
You studied music at the University of Southampton and then have ended up in the ministry, but have also used music, in particular jazz, which is what we're going to be talking about today, as an evangelistic tool. But one of our bugbears, as listeners will know, is, does art always have to be evangelistically useful? What about art for art's sake? Hans Ruckmacher would say, in his very strong accent, art needs no justification. But we'll get on to that. Where's he
from?
I don't know, but I think he's Dutch or something.
He's Dutch.
But I heard a talk from him, which was quite hard because it was also recorded on a cassette. It wasn't great.
Yeah.
But he kind of came over that. So, John, why don't you just tell us about how you got into music, what that looks like for you, and how you've pivoted towards jazz within that?
Yeah, great. So I grew up in a house where my dad was a music teacher, so I followed his footsteps. He taught me piano from a young age, but what I really wanted to do after hearing Phil Collins was play drums. So
was it a particular
drums,
Phil Collins track or album that did it?
But seriously, I think,
yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Great album.
Yeah.
I think it's embarrassing to admit you're a fan of Phil Collins these days, isn't it?
No, I think it's come out the other side. I think you're all right
Has
now.
it?
Yeah, 5 years ago, not so cool. Now you're good.
Okay.
That's right. Gated reverb for the
good
win.
today.
Sorry.
Yes. Say two late 40s men. No, Phil Collins is fine. It's fine. Everyone says Phil Collins is fine.
Yeah, it's fine again.
Yeah.
Drums became my favourite instrument, but so grew up playing loads of music, and actually my drum teacher was a famous jazz vibes player, which is fairly niche, but he played with Ronnie Verrill, who was the drummer he recorded the drums for the Muppets.
Whoa, okay, now you're talking our language.
No.
Yeah. So I met him a couple of times. Absolutely fascinating man. Walked with a hunch. He must have been in his late 70s when I met him, and he used to drive a sports car, rock up to these gigs and kind of get out of this sports car in this hunch position and then just remain in that hunch position for the rest of the evening. But I had the privilege of actually playing alongside him, which was very inspiring. So I think I played regularly in a jazz orchestra run by this guy called Roger Nobes, jazz vibe player, and that was really where my passion for jazz came. I was, first of all, I was the percussionist and sat behind a drummer who was a few years older than me and learnt everything I knew from him. Went to university and carried that on, really.
Right. So jazz in particular was always your preferred, was it?
So the thing about jazz, and as that's what we're talking about, is it's kind of the pinnacle of performance for, I guess, contemporary music performers. So particularly for drummers, if you want to test yourself, if you want to really explore your instrument, jazz is kind of where you go.
And that's because of the inherently improvisational quality of it, or?
Yeah, improvisation, and just it's one of those art forms where you're trying to explore, you're seeking to impress, and so you're seeking to kind of push the boundaries, and as a drummer technically it pushes you. So
and also you get a solo. I'm thinking, I listen to a lot of jazz quintet kind of stuff, or particularly I used to anyway. I still do a bit, but you might easily get a quite long drum solo where you're going to have to pull something out of thin air, and the keyboards pull back, the saxophonist stops for a bit, and it's all over to you and the bass, and then the bass gets their own solo as well. I've never liked bass solos.
If I could just
bass solos.
If I could just bring things full circle, I went to a Genesis concert in 1986 where Phil Collins played a 10-minute drum solo. I had never experienced such a thing before. I'm not sure I want to again, but it was great to have that in the context of a rock concert. It was quite unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah, the drum solo is the drum. So bass solos are the butt of all jazz jokes. Okay. Drum solos are the kind of most egotistical and long-winded solos you get. But they, and the thing about jazz is you just never know when the band leader might turn to you and go drum solo. So you're always on the seat of your pants and ready for it.
I feel like for the second episode in a row, I'm going to get to do a Spinal Tap jingle. Because
I love that,
we're talking about drummers. He died in a bizarre gardening accident. Police said, best left unsolved. Just like, because the police say that. That's the thing, isn't it? But anyway, sorry. That's what drummers are now making me think of. So why don't you talk a bit about... So actually, reset. For me, my gateway into jazz was initially Charlie Brown. So I used to love watching Charlie Brown. It was on the TV in the UK, and it was a mix of the tone of the show, but also the music. And the music was just like, I want all music to be like this. This is amazing, and you just wouldn't hear it anywhere else because it was such a specific vibe and tone.
How did it make you feel, James?
Unbelievably cool for a start.
Yeah, right.
But weirdly not cool because everybody, when you're 15, hates jazz. And meanwhile at school, so I learned the trumpet and then played in a big band at school, which was really cool. But it was never quite as cool as the music that I wanted to play, which was sort of veering into that Horace Silver, Bill Evans jazz quintet stuff. And I wish I'd learnt the piano, really, rather than the trumpet. I'm not really a jazz trumpet fan so much. But also, bear in mind, when I was about 15, the year was about 1989, 1990. They were not good years for pop music. And so, when Europe, the Final Countdown, is in the charts, it's
Lisa
pretty slim.
It's not great. Yeah,
it's pretty slim picking. So I used to tape Radio 2's Big Band special off the radio and listen to that all week until the next one. And so for me, jazz, and actually still now I listen to jazz. The latest, when Apple got the latest Snoopy in Space series, the actual animation, the comedy, as it were, I think it's really average at best. It's very preachy and expositional. But there's a couple of tracks on that which are so transcendently, wonderfully, beautifully fantastic. I can't stop listening to them. And for me, there's just something about the music which is as close as to I get to being really emotional. And I'm not a particularly emotional person. And I don't really know why that is. And it's partly because... And it's puzzled me for a long time. And it's because, well, how can I get so emotional about it? There aren't any words telling me what to think, telling me what the song is about, which is, of course, partly where some of the roots of jazz come from, isn't it? So maybe why don't we get into that roots of jazz stuff, and then maybe we can look at when jazz takes on a life of its own and doesn't require singing lyrics. Where did jazz come from originally?
Yeah, so that's something that I've got quite into, and have got a little event called the Roots of Jazz, because interestingly, it's rooted in the gospel. So obviously, it's related to blues music. Blues music would be secular. It was based on the woes and struggles of those caught up in the slave trade. Singing first work songs as they were in the field and expressing their emotions about the situation they found themselves in. That was the root of blues music. But amazingly, in the sort of great revival that happened around the same time, many of them were hearing the gospel, were taken along either to their white slave owners' church or went along to things called hush harbours or these praise events where they would go along and hear the gospel. And as they heard the gospel, it it completely reshaped the tone of their music, of course, because now they had a joy and a hope through that suffering. That is the roots of jazz in a nutshell, I guess. And just absolutely fascinated by that, both as a lover of jazz and a lover of Jesus.
It's really interesting how you talk about those Christian roots as well, because I guess we always start history slightly late. And so looking back, you think, well, the black roots of jazz would obviously mean that it has a religious background, it has a Christian background, but you think there's nothing inherently Christian about formerly African slaves. Africa wasn't a hotbed of Christianity. So at some point there was a sense in which there was a revival amongst the slave population of the US, and we just tend to assume it was inevitable. But actually, the more you think about it, the more incredibly counterculturally surprising it is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's entirely and highly unlikely that those who are being oppressed by these white Christians would turn to the gospel. But I guess reveals the miracle of the work of the Spirit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That even in that, they could find hope in Christ.
And that in itself is a gospel message, isn't it? Because obviously, Christianity has some roots in slavery itself when it talks about going back to Egypt. And I think you pick up on one or two of those things in the Roots of Jazz show, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that was, they found an affinity with the Israelites themselves and the story of the Exodus. And many of those early gospel spirituals are around the story of the Exodus, or, finding themselves in a new foreign land in the wilderness and that sort of thing. So they found their own story, in the story of the Bible, and we're able to relate to that in a deeper level than I guess most of us can.
So why don't
which is fascinating.
So why don't Christians like jazz then, John?
Well, you were saying, we were talking before, you said they kind of do as background music.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah, I think Christians have a strange affinity for jazz in that. I remember as a new young Christian at the CU that. And knowing that I played jazz, I was often asked to get a band together to play at an evangelistic event, which I always found a bit strange, but I didn't mind as long as I was getting the opportunity to play some jazz. So we would have a little band in the corner, and somehow the gospel would be sledgehammered into that event. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
And that continued into my early years in churches. And that was why I sort of this event, the Roots of Jazz, came about, because I just wasn't happy with that. I wasn't happy with just being a band in the background with the gospel being sledgehammered in through a testimony or something.
Yeah, when the actual roots of what you're playing is fundamentally Christian and about liberation and freedom from slavery in a spiritual sense to sin.
Yeah, exactly. And so just to say, Bill Edgar had done a lot of work on that, and I heard some of what he'd done, and he was a huge inspiration for then me going away and doing a lot more work on that, and that's where the event, the Roots of Jazz, came from.
The thing is, we don't really seem to mind borrowing musical genre in the church from places which are transparently completely secular. Given that most bands currently sound like basically a sort of a version of like 70s or 80s soft rock that's been slightly upgraded towards Coldplay or U2 or something. It's got that vague stadium rock. It always makes me laugh, actually, when you've got like a worship leader who's clearly modelled himself on that, and those sorts of sounds are basically modelled for a stadium, and you are in a room that's literally got about, 80 people in it, and there's that kind of tone of voice that they get, with sounds like, and now we're going to sing this and that, and you're like, mate, you're not talking to 4,000 people, it's just these people. So
with our lighters in the air.
Yeah, but all of that to say, it's interesting that we don't seem to have any problem there with, as it were, borrowing from secular music. So even if jazz didn't have demonstrably Christian origins, it still throws up the question, well, why is it that we don't see more services maybe that perhaps use that style, or just more Christians who seem to embrace it? Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, I think if you went to the Pentecostal church, you would see a lot more influence of jazz music in their style, and oh boy, I wish we had that in my church. But yeah, I mean, it is rooted in the history of African American people and in black culture, and so where I think you might find yourself in a more a church that is more highly populated by black people, you would see more influences of jazz harmonies, and therefore sort of the gospel music of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then 90s, sort of the Kirk Franklins and stuff like that. I'd love it. I would love that if that were in my church. I'm training up my son at the moment. He's listening to Kirk Franklin day and night, and is learning those harmonies, training him up for a future of leading some better music in our church.
And just for those, I'm genuinely curious about this. How would you describe the kind of style of jazz that you like to play best? I mean, is it more... I don't even know if these terms are completely redundant now, but sort of traditional, modern, like what? How would you bracket it, or is that a very ugly question to ask?
No, it's not an ugly question. No, so jazz is broad.
Ignorant question, but it's a good one. Give me some words to say to describe so that I can now ask this question.
If you've never heard Cooper and Cary have words before, this is how we.
This is all normal.
No. Jazz is very broad. I would probably be a fairly tame jazzer. I like playing most styles. The good thing about the broadness of it is that there are many different styles to explore, and they are sort of united in many ways. But yeah, you've got the original there's ragtime would kind of be early, and then your trad jazz as well from those sort of beginning of the 20th century, and then it morphed into several different styles. So as it moved out of New Orleans and into Chicago and New York, it became a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more organized, but then a little bit that experimental side of jazz continued, and that's when you get the sort of 60s and 70s, the Miles Davis, the Coltrane's pushing the boundaries in different ways, approaching sort of modal jazz and bebop and those sort of things. And those are great to play as well. I love that style of music. It's continues to be creative and based around improvisation, so it's still a lot of fun to play. And then you get into the more contemporary jazz that is just a little bit out there, and you've got to be probably smoking something to really enjoy it.
Plenty of incense in the service for that one. What? So I was going to ask you about that. Do you think it's I want to say, Jonathan, there's bits in the Bible about God being a God of order and not of chaos, of peace and harmony, and not chaos and disorder. So what business have we got with, dealing with musical genres which are all about kind of tearing up the rule books, and at least to the uninitiated like me. Yes, I know. It can sometimes sound sort of quite, like a cacophonous noise. Some people might say. And
it makes people angry. Jazz genuinely can make people properly furious.
And do you think, how should we be rightly thinking about these things as Christian people?
Yeah, there's a few things in there to jump off of, but I guess firstly the ordered nature of it. There's something about jazz that is both disordered and ordered. So there are structures within jazz. There are things about jazz that when you come together as a group, you know what's going to happen even before it's happened. You get to the end of a tune and you just know it's going to go da 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 boom. You just feel that, and
that's one of my favorites.
And you roll with that.
That one.
Yeah, it's a great ending. There's the 12-bar blues. There's rhythm changes. There's all these different orders to jazz, but within that, there's also the opportunity to explore and create. And so, I guess the answer to your question, how do we respond to that as Christians and see the goodness in that? We are, as with art and as you've discussed before on your podcast, we are creative beings. We're made in the image of God who likes to create. A God who created something from nothing, and in jazz that's exactly what you're sort of doing, although at the same time there are rules and order beneath that. There are harmonies that you've learnt, there are chord changes you've learnt, there are scales and modes that you've learnt that fit or don't fit sometimes you want a bit of both of that, because you want a slight dissonance that's going to resolve. And there's so much in there that reflects, I think. I
think that's I think that's so important. I think the orderliness of jazz is beautiful, and we've talked before about the oughtness of endings with regard to story. But there's an oughtness to music as well. And actually, I would say truly chaotic music is the Romance classical music, where you have a symphony which you don't really know where it's going. It's like a story that is unpredictable, whereas music, jazz, which is fundamentally also from ragtime, really, isn't it? That feels like the J.S. Bach of jazz is Scott Joplin. And you've got the theme and the variations, you've got the key changes and stuff. And so whenever a jazz track is sort of riffing in some direction, we know it's going to land at some point. It's going to resolve itself. And I think we see that in the Bible as well. I think I've really been thinking a lot about the story of the Bible and the stories, and they just go round and round and round in slightly bigger loops and with variations. So, for example, God's appearances at wells in Genesis and at springs. So you get Jacob at a well. You get Isaac meeting his wife at a well, so on his behalf. He's not there. And then you get Hagar, who is cast out. She is also at a well. And then later on, you get Jesus with the Samaritan woman at a well. And so there are just all of these cycles within Scripture of a theme that's been established and is repeated, but in a modified form. And in a way, the modification is the interesting bit. Otherwise, it's just flat repetition. And to some extent, nobody wants that. And so if we, as God's image bearers, are recreators in his image, we're going to take his patterns and make them ever more complex. But fundamentally, they're still going to be using the same order. And then and then occasionally it just sort of feels like it's really become disconnected from the order, and that's when it really starts to sound hard. If you're really experienced on this stuff, you sort of know that it's going to end in a sort of a pleasing way. But then sometimes it doesn't, and that's what makes it interesting. And that's when I guess the visual equivalent is anti-art, which is, there you go, pile of bricks on the ground. Is that art? To which the answer is, well, not really, but thanks for asking the question.
But isn't there a jazz equivalent of the pile of bricks?
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, as a believer, should we embrace that and say, actually, no, this says something really important about, I don't know, dissonance or something in a world without God, which is the standard sort of modern justification for everything that's in there? Or do we say, actually, do you know what? We're people of hope. We do believe in an ultimate resolution, and therefore we're looking to explore musical genres where we can actually demonstrate that, or subgenres. Do you know what I mean? Or am I?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of music, the best music comes out of mistakes as well. And I think that's what jazz shows you all the way through, that all these different genres that come out of it, they often say that there's no wrong notes in jazz. Not entirely true, but the best things come out of mistakes. My son, as I was saying, is getting into music quite considerably. He's doing his GCSE composition at the moment, and I was listening to it, and I said, I love that bit. And he said, I played that chord by accident, but I liked it, so I kept it in. And that often, the more you explore, improvise, it's when you do that, when you're creating, often it's through your mistakes that you find, I like the sound of that. Let's riff with that, see where it takes us. Just another thing about, as you were saying, the sort of repeated patterns found in Scripture, I guess it's worth saying for those who don't know much about jazz, what you get in jazz is you get the tune, you get the theme, what's called the head, which you'll play once or twice, and then you're left to then improvise, and you'll go, but you're still going round that same head, that same chord sequence, but you're creating new melodic ideas, you're riffing off the theme, you're creating your own theme. That's kind of how jazz works. And what's interesting is, we've been doing this event, The Roots of Jazz, for I think about 7 or 8 years. We play the same tunes every time, but we're not bored of it, because actually each time it sounds different, because each time someone will improvise differently, or we'll have a new member of the band will come in and play with us, or someone will take it a slightly different direction.
And also, you're just in a different room. You know, it's just like it's a Thursday, and it just sounds different because it's a Thursday. You know, or actually, I mean, here's the weird one: it's a full moon. I don't know if it's a thing within live music performance, but within comedy, audiences are weird on full moons. That's just you know, any experienced stand-up comedian will say, yeah, I don't understand it either, but there's definitely something in it. Full moons, audiences are weird. Sidebar, one for another time.
Yeah. Well, the kind of the repeating refrain thing is interesting. I was saying to you guys just before we started recording that the two albums that I bought on CD, because I kept seeing them listed as, you know, some of the greatest albums ever made in this genre, and I thought I really need to understand this. So I bought A Love Supreme by John Coltrane and Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And there's that wonderful thing. I mean, I didn't get it at the time, but having subsequently sort of listened to it a lot more and read about it, there is that wonderful thing at the end of the first movement, I think it is, of A Love Supreme, where you have the four notes, A Love Supreme, A Love Supreme, and he does it in 12 different keys at the end. So he does all the different keys. So again, that speaks to the variation thing that you were talking about. The idea being, and it is quite a cerebral thing, that he's communicating wherever you look, that love supreme exists. You can't go anywhere to escape a love supreme. God's love is everywhere, in everything. And he obviously made it as a very self-consciously spiritual piece of work, which is probably why people like Philip Larkin really hated it, because as a dyed-in-the-wool sort of atheist, he wasn't keen on that sort of thing, found it a bit pompous. But yeah, the idea that jazz is this sort of slightly, there's no wrong notes kind of idea. The more you read about it, the more you think there's a deep order here that the best practitioners are adhering to and thinking of, even in the variation.
Yeah, so we, as I say, we perform quite regularly as a group, but often we're short of saxophonists. So someone will phone up a friend, we need a saxophonist next week, could you come and play? And we'll not have time to rehearse, and they'll just slot in because they know the patterns, they know the routine. And when I second half, I'll often say, oh, this is the first time we've played with so and so, and the audience are, you know, dumbfounded, can't understand. And how long did you rehearse? Oh, 10 minutes before the show. You know, jazz is like that. And in fact, the first time we ever did the Roots of Jazz, I think I said to you guys, I had come up with this idea. I'd sent out the charts. Here's the songs I want to do. Here's a rough idea of where I want to take them. It'd be great if we can get together at 5 o'clock. Event starts at 7:30. We'll have a couple of hours to rehearse, and we can rest before the performance. And the saxophonist, the last member of the band, rocked up at 7 p.m. And it was a fly by the seat of your pants event, which jazz is at its best when it's like that. And I think that was probably the best one we've ever done, just because it was raw. That's how jazz should be, and it worked, and we kept doing it ever since.
Do you think audiences are more forgiving because they know it's improvisational? A little bit like with comedy. Do you think that, you know, that's a thing or not?
I think definitely, yeah. But I think also jazz is one of those musics where the people playing it are enjoying it a lot more than the audience quite often. But in a way, that's not a bad thing, because that is contagious. And you know, I've got one of our players, Andre Brown. He's an amazing saxophonist. And when he's on our gig, it's just phenomenal, because he lives it, he breathes it, and he just draws the crowd along with him. And I think that's the other thing to say about jazz is it is storytelling, and that's why I know you guys all. That's why I imagine James loves it, because jazz is storytelling, and you're telling a story as you improvise. Maybe you're telling your own story, maybe you're creating a story off the top of your head, but it is storytelling, and that is at the heart of jazz, partly because of where it came from. It's rooted in the gospel, but it is expressing a joy. And as Bill Edgar talks about when he talks about the roots of jazz, it's an expressing a joy that kind of is inexpressible in any other way, because it's come through sorrow, it's come through difficulty and hardship. It's true joy. It's deeper than happiness. Happiness is kind of a shortcut. Joy it's come through the other side of suffering. And so jazz it is a deep art form. And James was saying, you know, that when he listens to it, he finds himself being more emotional than you might with other forms. And I think that's probably because that's the heart of it. It's telling a story, and you can relate to it.
Yeah, except the old conservative evangelical in me is going, what do you mean a story? What story is this? So
There's no words,
is it? Does a G represent a man, and is an F a dog? And so when it goes from G to F, it's like a man taking a dog for a walk. Is that? And then what does he do? Fall in a river? What's the story?
No, he plays a saxophone,
and
doesn't he?
You know, put it like that. Obviously, it's idiotic, and I am parodying for effect and comedy, but that's my job. But there's just I just always want to push back against this notion that something should be. I don't get it. Stop. It's like no. If you don't get it, then keep listening. And you know, it's a bit like the conversation we had with Ali Gordon about art recently. About when you go to a gallery, just have a look at the painting and just look, and what does it make you think of? And we're so obsessed with right and wrong answers. What is this painting meant to be saying to me? It's like, look, if it could be summed up in a sentence, then the artist should have just written a sentence and written a book or a poem.
Yeah, that's what David Lynch always says in interviews. What's the film about, David? And he's like, the film is the speaking.
Yeah,
you're like, that's the point.
Cooper and T have words.